A Lantern, Chapter 13. By the next night, the stalks of field corn were skeletons, a few delicate veins of leaves left, like so many white bones bleaching on the desert of the fields. At the end of 3 days, the oat field was stripped almost as bare as the day the plow had finished its work. The young orchard was a graveyard of hopes. Some of the small grain previously harvested had been saved, and luckily one digging of early potatoes was in the hole in the ground in which Will always kept them. But everything else went through the crunching incisors of the horde. It was as though the little grayish-green fiends became a composite whole. One colossal insect into whose grinding maw went all the green of the fields and the gardens, all the leaves and tender twigs of the young fruit trees, all the dreams and hopes of the settlers. The pests were everywhere. With nightmarish persistence, they appeared in everything. As tightly as Will kept the well covered, he drew them up in the bucket, so that he began going back to the old spring for water. Abbey caught them eating the curtains of the little half-windows and sent them to a fiery death. She was forced to dry the weekly wash around the cook stove. Her one attempt to hang it in the sun ending speedily with a dozen perforations in the first billowing garment. The garden was a total loss. They had tried to save some of the beans by putting gunny sacks over them and weighing them down with stones from the creek bed. The grasshoppers, after eating the beans, had begun on the gunny sacks. "Will they eat the stones too, Mother?" Mac wanted to know, and they could not laugh at him. Abbey wrote a letter to her sister Mary, telling of this last hard piece of luck. Even letters were expensive luxuries, so that one was made to do for the entire group of relatives back in eastern Iowa. She gave the letter to Will, who said that he would ride over to the little post office in the Lutz store as soon as he had finished caring for the stock. In an hour, Will came in, holding the letter by a corner. The edges of the envelope had been eaten all the way around with little neat flutings, so that the two sides fell apart and the letter fluttered to the floor. The pocket of his old denim coat, where the letter had lain, was flapping down, cut on two sides by the same diabolical jaws. What could you do? You could not fight them. You could not kill them. They were an army with an uncanny and unnatural power. Abbey looked out upon the devastation of the fields and the garden upon which they had both worked so hard. The hot wind blew over the rooms with Mephistophelian laughter. She looked up at the cloudless blue. Huge, cruel, sardonic. "God, you ought to help," she cried aloud. "We can't do it alone. You ought to help." All through August, Abbey went about in a dull, stupid way, depressed by the last hard luck that had descended upon them and the knowledge that her fourth child was coming. She was nervous, cross to Will and to the children. Sometimes in a temper she jerked one of her little tots by the arm or spanked one angrily, figuratively standing off and looking at her own actions in contempt. She seemed doing things she did not want to do, seeing a nervous, cross woman who was not herself allow her love for her husband and babies to begin slipping. The song in Abbey's throat was stilled that summer, and not even an echo of the melody lingered on. For the first time she was sorry about her condition, sorry and bitter. One more mouth to feed, she said to herself acridly. She who was a born mother. And then, in a sudden revulsion of feeling at her disloyalty to motherhood, she thought, "Oh, I don't want to feel that way about a child. I ought not to say that. I won't. I never will again." In the letter which came in time from her sister Mary was the comforting word. "Well, Abbey, you ought to have married Dr. Ed Matthews. His wife was here visiting this summer, and she had fine clothes, a purple silk dress and a little lavender velvet bonnet with pansies on it, and the widest satin strings and lavender silk mitts. She has a paisley shawl, too, and a big cameo breastpin." Abbey let the letter fall into her lap and sat thinking of Ed Matthews in New York. Occasionally someone had written an item about him. Ed Matthews and his bride came to visit. She's an Eastern girl and tremendous stylish. And later, they say Ed is in a New York hospital where they have as many as 50 beds. And now, sitting there with the hot wind blowing over the stripped fields, Abbey's thoughts went back to the knoll near the big woods. "You're wonderful, Abbey. You're gorgeous. You cock it. I'll take you with me. You can study all you want with the best teachers. And now sitting there with the hot wind blowing over the stripped fields. If she had known, if she could have foreseen the drought and the grasshoppers, the blizzards and the winds that were never still, the hard work and the privations, the song that might never be sung, the 4 babies in 8 years. No, no, she pulled herself out of the dream. No, no, don't let me think it. Don't let me think of thinking it. It's wicked. There's nobody but Will. It's just the crop failures and the terrible hard luck that made me think it. Those things have nothing to do with love. But even as she said it, Abbey knew that it was not true. Abbey knew that unless you were very strong, those things have something to do with love. In an overwhelming return of affection for the children, she picked little John up and covered him with kisses, her tears on his cheeks. She drew Margaret to her and cuddled her too. Margaret's little hand had a dingy rag around it to cover a cut, and in an ecstasy of mother emotion, Abbey kissed the little hand, kissed the plump baby neck between the soft brown ringlets and the colorless calico dress. She went to the door and called, "Mac, come in." "What do you want, Mother?" "Nothing, Mac. Nothing but to kiss you, darling." "Oh, little son, I love you so. Kiss Mother, Mac." Mac, who was 7 now, and a little superior to the demonstration of women folks, stood the ordeal with fortitude and then pulled quickly away. "I'm helping Father sort things. All the nails for him, the little ones and the horseshoe ones. And that's it, Mac. That's a good boy. Always help Father, Mac. He's the best father in the world. You'll never forget it, will you, darling?" She did not want Will to know what Mary had written, so she read the letter aloud to him, blithely skipping over the tart reference to Ed Matthews. During that summer, the whole family went in the wagon along the creek to scour the thickets for wild grapes and wild plums. Abbey rode 3 miles on horseback to a Mrs. Tomlinson's to get some late pie plant, which had miraculously escaped the scourge of the robber insects. And when Will came in one day with 2 huge beets, which he had found when taking down a pile of boards, Abbey sent word to Henry Lutz's to come over, and the 2 families feasted on potatoes, cornbread, and sliced boiled beets. Everyone was in want. In the early fall, people began going past the house. Going home, they were all reported. Many times parties of them stayed all night. They had their own quilts and would arrange their beds on the main room floor. They were beaten, they said. One could stand a few disappointments and failures, but when everything turned against one, there was no use trying to fight. "The land hasn't turned against us," Will would argue stubbornly. "It's the finest, blackest loam on the face of the earth. The folks that will just stick it out, you'll see the climate change, more rains and not so much wind, when the trees grow. We've got to keep at the trees. Someday this is going to be the richest land in the Union, the most productive. I bet anything next year." Always next year. It was a mirage, thought Abbey, an apparition that vanished when one came to it. 6 times now they had said, "Next year the crops will be fine." And so she could not throw off the blue mood that had descended upon her, a horde of worries that had come upon her even as the horde of grasshoppers had come upon the land. The thought that there was nothing to do with, that they could scarcely keep body and soul together, that she probably would never be able now to do anything with her voice, that another child was coming, they all harassed and tormented her. All fall there was in her mind a tired disinterest over things. In spite of what he said, that surface courage which he pretended had returned to him, Abbey detected that Will, too, was morose. To her keen eye, he seemed dull and stoical, underneath an assumption of cheerfulness. Before cold weather, the old grasshoppers were gone. But first they had taken infinite plans to leave a reminder of themselves in the newly broken prairie everywhere. Holes the size of lead pencils in which they laid 24 eggs in a sack. In a 6-inch square of ground, Will, testing their number, found a double handful of the next year's hatching. There seemed not even a hope for the following spring. It was in November that the barrel and box came from the folks back home. Will drove up to the soddy with rattling announcement of their arrival. A letter from Grandpa Deal had been the forerunner of the donations, and already Abbey knew that an old brass horn of Denny's was among the things for Mac. She determined to slip it out without his knowledge and put it away for Christmas. They all gathered around the barrel while Will pried open the top, Mac and Margaret dancing about in an ecstasy of excitement. The first thing to be taken out was an envelope marked "For Abbey," in Grandpa Deal's handwriting. In it was $20. Abbey cried a little, tears of love and homesickness, happiness and relief, and put it away with secret thoughts of the desired organ. She sensed that Grandpa had slipped it in with his one hand, the last thing, so Grandma would not see it. There were flower seeds and sugar and beans, seed corn and dried apples in the barrel. Mother Mackenzie had tied and sent 2 thick comforts. Regina Deal sent an old soiled white silk bonnet with a bead ornament and a cluster of 3 pink feathers on it. Tips, Abbey told the children they were, and a pair of dirty white stays and some old white hoop skirts. Abbey laughed until she cried at the sight of them. "Maybe I could put the hoops over some stakes next summer and keep the setting hens in them," she suggested. She put them over her work dress, the hoops and the stays both, and perched the dirty bonnet on her red-brown hair. Dancing about in them, the 3 noble tips nodding with uncertain dignity, as though, like their former owner, they had no sense of humor. She pushed Will and Mac and Margaret into position for a square dance and showed the children how to whirl your partner, and Alaman left. The 4 of them pranced about in the impromptu dance, the children in their patched, dingy clothing, Will in his denim work things, and Abbey in the foolish soiled cast-offs which Regina had sent with so little thought. The 2 other children laughed and clapped their hands and shouted that they never had so much fun in their lives, and little John toddled in and out between them in an ecstasy of bubbling spirits. It broke something in Abbey, some tight-bound band around her heart and throat, which had not been loosed for months. She hid the old brass horn of Denny's in the bedroom. She put away the precious dried apples and popcorn, the seed corn and the big solid greenings from the orchard behind Grandpa Deal's house. She hugged the huge warm quilts as though they were the fat pudding bag body of Maggie Mackenzie. The bad luck was temporary. They were young and well. The children were all healthy youngsters. Why, how wicked she had been. She was only 27. She mustn't let her voice rust the way she had done this summer. In another year or so she could have an organ and maybe even get to a music teacher. She mustn't let youth slip away and her voice go with it. She was ashamed of herself that she had not sung for months. O Lady of the Lee, fair and young and gay was she, her voice full-throated, mellowed now with tribulations and sympathy. The children clapped their hands that Mother was singing. Beautiful exceedingly, the Lady of the Lee. She replenished the fire of twisted hay and corn cobs in the stove, with the 4 holes and the iron hearth in front. She cooked cornmeal mush for supper and set the table. Several times she sang the same verses over. Many a wooer sought her hand, for she had gold and she had land. The tea kettle sang, and the children chattered happily at the window. She lighted the coal oil lamp with the red flannel in the bowl and washed her hands in the tin basin. The prairie twilight came on. The winds died down. Everything at her command, the Lady of the Lee. Will came in from doing the chores. "It's the nicest time of day, isn't it, Will? The red fire of the corn, the steaming tea kettle, supper ready, and the children all alive and well. And you and I together." Will put an arm around her for a brief, rare moment. "It is the nicest time of day, Abbey girl."